When you're building a website UI, knowing how to use a wrapper or container is one of the most essential building blocks. Wrappers are super handy because you can put all the content inside the wrapper, limit the width so that it's not super wide, and center it on your page. However, the problem with basic wrappers is that the content is stuck inside the wrapper, and it's pretty much impossible to go outside the bounds of that wrapper without causing a huge hassle, especially if you also want to have a grid layout on your website. Now, having your content go all the way out to the edges of the screen is what's called full bleed. And in this video, we're going to be taking a deep dive into how you can build full bleed wrappers without having to have a bunch of nested divs. We'll start with the easiest and simplest wrapper, and then work our way up in levels of difficulty until we reach the most powerful and most complex one, which, spoiler alert, uses some math. Also, I wanted to mention that I've just created a Patreon-type membership called Coder Coders Coder Club. For $5 a month, you can get ad-free, early access to my videos before they hit YouTube, and you have the option of having your name featured in the end credits of my videos. Now, please don't feel obligated, but if you would like to support me continuing to make coding tutorials like these, I've linked it down below. Alright, let's get into the video. Alright, so we're starting with the simplest wrapper, which is the basic max width wrapper. So in here we have a headline and we have a paragraph, and they're both inside this div, which has a max width set to 60 rems or 960 pixels. And it has margin inline set to auto. And what this does is that it's going to center the content inside its container when it's greater than 60 rems. And then any extra space you have is going to go on the left and the right sides in the margins. And I also have some padding added on the top and bottom just to have some breathing room. Now, as the viewport width decreases, when it hits 960, which is basically right here, the div, which is display block by default, is going to be 100% of its container's width going all the way across from left to right. And this is the simplest way of creating a wrapper. However, you might notice that on these smaller viewport widths, the content feels kind of cramped because there's no space between the sides and the edges of the screen. And this is because in our rules, we just have the max width set and there's no space added in our styles. So to fix this, you can level up your wrapper to the next one called the min function wrapper. So this wrapper has the max width of 60 rems on desktop. And then when you get down to smaller viewport widths, you can see that there's actually some space on the left and the right, and it's set in the margins. And how this works is all with one style rule. And this is a pretty cool trick that I've seen from Kevin Powell and also Stephanie Eccles. So what's happening in the styles is that instead of just setting a max width like we did with our first one here, you set the width property to be one of two options using the CSS min function. Now the min function is going to track two possible values, and whichever one is smaller is going to be the final value. So in our case here, our two options at any given viewport width is going to be 100% of the parent's width minus 40 pixels, and the other option is going to be 60 rems, which again was 960 pixels. So at smaller viewport widths, like let's say an iPad, which has a viewport width of 810 pixels, minus 810 pixels minus 40 pixels is 770 pixels. And since 770 pixels is less than 960 pixels, or 60 rems, 770 pixels is the final width of the wrapper, which is what's happening here. So the reason that we have this minus 40 pixels in our width is that so we have some space outside the wrapper, because the wrapper width is set to 100% of the parent's width minus 40 pixels. So the yellow that you see on the left and right is the margin that's basically left over because the width has minus 40 pixels, and then the margin inline auto rule centers it within the parent, so it makes the space on either side the same. Now when you're on larger viewports, like for example, we're at 1200 pixels here, 100% of the width is going to be 1200 pixels minus 40 pixels, which is 1160 pixels. And looking at the min function, 1160 pixels, which is 100% minus 40 pixels, is greater than 960 pixels or 60 rems. So in this case, the min will choose 960 pixels. And if we look in our layout styles, that's what this wrapper is set to. it has a 960 pixel width of content. And again, any extra space is going to be evenly divided on the left and the right with margin inline auto, which effectively centers the wrapper. However, one downside of this approach is that if you need a background color or a background image, and let me add a background color to this div, then you can see that the background color, which I've set with this linear gradient, is not going all the way across because the entire width of this div has been limited by our min function here. So to fix this and make our background gradient go all the way across, you're going to have to go up one more level and put your wrapper inside a parent element. All right, so in this next example, I have put the wrapper div inside a parent element, which I usually use a section tag for this. And then you can set the background color or background image on this parent section tag, and then it's going to go full bleed all the way across. And you can see this happening here on our website, where the background linear gradient that we have is now going all the way across. And then inside, the wrapper div that we have is now only going to limit the width of the actual text content inside that section tag. And this type of wrapper is actually the one that I've used most often in the past. However, I like keeping my markup as simple as possible, and I do have to admit it's a little bit annoying having to add another HTML element, the section tag, just to accomplish this, background going all the way across. Fortunately, you can do this without having to add another div or section tag to your markup using what's called a full bleed grid wrapper. Now to do this, what you want to do is you want to make your wrapper a grid container. So in this example here, I have made the grid wrapper actually a section tag, but you can see that there's no nested div. And then in it, I've set the grid template to have 3 columns. Now, if we look in our styles here, the first and then the last column are 1FR, which means that they'll take up any available space left over, and then they'll evenly divide the available space between them. And then the middle column is basically where all of this magic happens. And it's set to the same value as the width that we previously had, which is, min 100% minus 40 pixels or 60 rems. Essentially what this is doing is making the entire element the wrapper. And we've used grid styles to divide the element up into columns, and we're making just that middle column the wrapper that gets its width to max out at 60 rems. And this is a approach that I saw from Josh Como from a really great blog post that he wrote about full bleed content, which I have linked down below. Now in this grid, the H2 tag and the paragraph tag are actually grid children. And to place them both in the middle column, what we've done is in our styles, we set any direct children of the wrapper, which is the FB wrapper class. Any direct children using the wildcard tag selector is going to start on grid column 2, and that's going to be right here after the first 1FR column. So with this approach, you can set a background color or a background image like we have on the parent wrapper, and it's going to go full bleed by default. And using grid in this way also gives you the option of having full bleed content. So in this example, I have an image tag, and you can see that the image is going full bleed, but it's still using the FB wrapper as its parent. And we've been able to set the image to go full bleed because we've set the grid column to start at grid line 1 instead of grid line 2 like we did before. And then it ends at grid line -1, which is the last line all the way on the right side of the grid. So, this approach works pretty well if you just have, one element like an image that you want to go full bleed. But what if you want to have more than one grid child in that row, which is a pretty common design pattern? So if you want to do that, you're going to have to level up again and use a full bleed grid wrapper with grid columns. All right, so in this next example, I'm going to start by showing you an example of a design in Figma. So a lot of times in designs, you're going to have the main content area divided up into 12 columns, at least for desktop. And this is what we have going on here. We have the main content in this website design within these blue columns, and there's 12 columns. And you can see that, for example, in this top section here, out of the 12 columns, this text block is taking up 5 columns. Then it looks like we have 1 column of space here. And then we have an image on the right that's taking up 6 columns. And this design, by the way, is a Front-End Mentor challenge. And if you want to watch me talk through building this entire website from scratch, you can actually find it on my second channel, Coder Builds, which I've linked somewhere up here and also down in the description. Now, just as a disclaimer, at this point in the video, things do start getting pretty complex in terms of our wrapper styles. But it is the only way that I've found to work where you can have both full bleed content and also have the main content within these columns. So here is our example code that I'm going to kind of walk you through. So here's the HTML up here in the source code of Firefox. And I have this blue card, and then I have an image of a cute cat. Now I want to put them on the same row with the card on the left and the image on the right, with both of them taking up about half of the space. And then I also want the image to extend full bleed all the way out to the right side of the screen. So in our styles, we are starting with the style rules of the grid template columns from the last example, where we had that one middle column, which takes up most of the space. And then we have one column on the left and one column on the right, taking up any available space left over. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this one big middle column and we're going to divide it up into 12 columns of equal width. So the way we can do this is by using the repeat function. So I'm going to start by adding repeat and then the function. Let's add our closing parentheses. And because we want to make 12 columns, I'm going to repeat this 12 times. And then we're going to add a comma, and then we need to set the column width. Now, this part is a little bit more tricky, but we need to divide up this space into 12 equal parts. Fortunately, we can do this with the CSS calc function, which is really handy, and it lets you combine numbers that have different units. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this whole min function inside a calc function. So calc, parentheses, and then we want to add our close parentheses. And we are having a lot of parentheses, so we want to make sure that things are around the right parts of basically our function. So we have our space with the min function, and it ends with the yellow parentheses, it looks like. And then I want to divide this by 12. And then we just want to make sure that the 12 is within the calc function, which it does look like it is. So now let's save. And now on our website, we have our grid with the first 1FR column. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 columns. Then we have the last column, which is the last 1FR column. Now, obviously, we need to place each child in the right part of the grid so things don't look so weird like they do now. So the first child is the card div. And right now I have some styles that made each direct child in the grid start at grid column line 2, which you can see is happening here. But let's add some more styles that are just for the card. So grid column. And we do want it to start at line 2, which means it'll skip that first 1FR column. And then I want it to extend across half of the 12 columns, which means it'll cover 6 columns. So if it starts at 2, if we add 6, we'll get 8. So we're having it go from 2 and end at 8, which is the halfway point. So if we save, now you can see that the card is indeed going across half of our 12 columns. All right, then for the cat image, I'm going to use the image tag selector, and we're going to set grid column for that. And we want it to start where the card ended because we want them to be on the same row. So the card ended at line 8. So we're going to start the image at grid column line 8. And we wanted it to go all the way out to the right edge, to the very edge of the screen to be full bleed. So we wanted to go to the very last line, which we can designate as line -1. And if you haven't worked with the grid lines like that before, the way that it works is that grid lines are numbered from left to right, grid column lines, that is, starting at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But then you also have another numbering that starts from the very right side starting with -1, and then it goes down. So -1, -2, -3, and so on all the way to the other side. And the reason this is handy is because that means you can use the -1 grid line number to designate the very last column line in the grid. And this is going to be true no matter how many columns you have in your grid. So I use that a lot when I want things to go all the way to the end. So start at 8 and end at -1. And let's save. And I can see, if I zoom out, the cat image is going all the way across to the very edge of the screen, whereas the blue card is, kind of ending, and we have that extra space on the left side. So, this full bleed effect is made possible by what we did here, where we divided up that middle space into 12 columns. So in our styles, I'm actually just going to delete that direct child thing because we don't actually need to use it. Now, you might be wondering this already, but what about gap space? Because in our current grid, we are not using any gap, and there's no space between the card and the image. So if you want to add space between the card and the image, you need to add a gap. However, this may cause some issues, and you'll see why in 1 second. So let's add a gap, and I'm going to set it to 30 pixels. So let's keep an eye on the website here, and when I save, things got a lot wider, and you might notice that now we have horizontal scroll bars, which is generally not desirable at all. So what happened here? Well, what's happening is that with grid, the gap space is actually completely separate from how the column size is calculated. The grid's not going to take gap into account, and so that means that we divided up the space for the columns with our grid template columns property. And then on top of that, we decided to add 30 pixels of gap space between all the columns. And with gaps, you're going to have one less number of gap spaces than columns because gaps only exist between columns. They don't, happen at the outsides of the grid. So if we're just thinking about the sort of middle 12 columns of the grid, we're going to have 12 columns. And between those 12 columns, we're going to have 11 gap spaces, again, because you always have one less gap space than you have number of columns. I'm going to pull out my calculator here and figure out, what the width of everything is. So according to our styles, for desktop, the content is going to max out at 960 pixels. It's 960. In addition to that, we have to add that gap space, and that's going to be 30 pixels times 11 gap spaces, and that's 330. So if we add that together, we get 1290. And then we also need to add another 60 pixels to that for the gaps between the first 1FR column and then the last 1FR column. So 1290 plus 60 is 1350. So that means that if you have desktop widths of less than 1350, the grid's actually going to be wider than the available space. And you can see that's what's happened here. We're at, I don't know if you can see that, but we're at 1241 pixels, and we have those horizontal scroll bars, and we have them all the way up until they disappear at basically 1350. And again, that's because that gap space is being added on top of the columns, which are already taking up 100% of the width minus 40 pixels, of course. And that is adding the scroll bars when we get below 1350 pixels. And personally, I don't really love that grid operates this way because, at least for me, it seems like it would make more sense for the gap space to be calculated along with the column size. But in some ways, we kind of caused this ourselves because we used 100%, which is the parent's width, to calculate the column width. But I'm sure there's a reason that, grid works this way. It just feels a bit weird to me that we have this problem. So all this to say, if we want gap, which I think is a pretty common need when you're using grid, but we don't want the grid to, overflow and have horizontal scroll bars, then what can we do? Well, again, as you might imagine, we'll need to level up and use a full bleed grid wrapper with gap. All right, so because the gap spaces are taking away from the available space that we want to go to columns, we need to subtract the gap space when we're calculating our column size in our grid template columns property. So I know, again, this is going to feel very complicated, but this is one of those things that if you put in a little extra work up front, It is a lot of work, but once it's set up, then you can just kind of keep using it and reusing it without having to write everything from scratch every time. So this is just one of those things that can make things more convenient once it has that initial setup phase. So what we want to do here is that we want to subtract the gap space when we're calculating our column size before we divide it up into 12. So we want to get the total amount of gap space. So again, we have 11 gaps because we have 12 columns for the main content, aside from the full bleed stuff, and each gap is 30 pixels. And 30 times 11 is 330, but if you don't want to do the math, you can actually make CSS do the math for you, and we can add the multiplication into our calc function here. All right, so we want to make sure we're doing things correctly here. So the min function, we want to add the total gap space to that sum, or whatever that final value is, before we divide by 12. So right after the min function, I'm going to add minus, because we're subtracting the gap space, 11 gap spaces times 30 pixels. But we want to make sure that this is happening before we divide by 12. So we do need to add yet another set of parentheses around the min function, and then around the minus 11 times 30 pixels before we divide by 12. All right, so now let's save. And now on our site, let me go down to the smaller. So now we are at 1297. So we're at 1300, which is less than the 1350 mark that we had before to not have horizontal scrolling. And we don't have horizontal scrolling, which is pretty great. And this does look pretty good on desktop. However, I haven't added any styles for tablet and mobile. And, as we decrease the viewport width, things look okay. But you can kind of see that, it might be hard to see. You can see that a lot of the grid space is now getting taken up by the gaps and the columns themselves are just getting like super narrow. So the reason we don't really want that is because we're going to have horizontal scrolling again as our viewport width gets less and less, because we're always going to have that 11 columns of gap space. So, when you get down to mobile, there's just not enough available space to have the 11 gaps, and also, whatever additional space you need for the columns, as well as the 2 1FR columns. So we just have too many columns for those smaller viewports, so let's decrease the number of columns for tablet and mobile. So I'm going to adjust our styles, and I'm going to make the default styles, meaning styles outside of any media queries, the mobile styles. So let's create some media queries for tablet and desktop just to kind of get started. So media, let's add the width, and let's make it greater than or equal to 43.75 EMs, which is 700 pixels. So we'll just add a little note here, 700 pixels. And then we want to make our desktop media query. So that's going to be, instead of 43.75 EMs, let's make that 62.5 EMs, which is 1,000 pixels. Okay. The first thing we want to do is, we can obviously see this is kind of messed up. The first thing I want to do is change the gap on mobile to be 20 pixels instead of 30, because 130 pixels of gap just kind of seems like a lot for mobile. And also, if you remember, in our initial min function, we had set one of the choices to be 100% minus 40 pixels to put 20 pixels of gap, or of space, on the left and right sides of the wrapper. So I want the gap on mobile to match that. Otherwise, things might kind of look a little bit weird. So let's copy this gap of 30 pixels, and we don't want the 30 to start until tablet. So we'll just change it to 20 on mobile first. Okay, so let's also copy the grid template column style rule. And again, this was the desktop style. So we're just going to paste it in for tablet, and we're going to change that later. And then on desktop, it will use this rule, and it should be fine on desktop. So let's save that. And now let's go back into our mobile styles and we want to change our grid template. So instead of 12 columns, on mobile I think we're going to have just 2 columns with 1 gap of space between them. So that means that we need to adjust our, I guess you can kind of call it a formula or maybe an expression in math. I'm not sure of exactly the right term for that. But basically in our mobile styles, I want to change any 12 to 2. So let's change the repeat number and then also change so that it divides by 2 instead of 12. And we also need to change the number of gap spaces, which instead of 11, it should be 1. And then we also need to change the amount of gap space to 20 because we changed it to be 20 on mobile. So let's save that just to save our changes. So now you can see things do look a bit better because we just have the 2 grid columns. But we do need to update our styles for the card and the image tag. So for mobile, so let's start by adding the media queries for both of these selectors. So it's going to be tablet and then desktop. And then I'm also just going to copy this whole set of media queries and then add it to the image tag. Okay, so now for the card, I'm going to copy this, and this is the desktop styles. So I'm just going to paste it in for desktop and tablet. Okay, so what I want to happen is I want the card to be on the first row and the image to be on the second row. And I am still going to have the image go full bleed out to the right side, whereas the card will have space on left and right. So if we just have 2 columns, we want the card to start at grid column line 2 like it was, and then we want it to extend 2 columns, so it should end at 2, 3, 4, or we can number it using negative numbers from the right side and have it end at -2. And if you remember, the -1 line is going to be the farthest right line, and then it numbers going down from right to left. So the -2 grid column line is going to be the one here, which is the space on the side. Okay, so let's save that, and then let's work on the image. So the image, I want to be on the row below the card. So we want it to start at grid column line 2 again, and then we do want it to extend out to full bleed. So we'll leave the grid column line end at -1. So let's save that. So now we can see that if I zoom out a little bit, here is our iPhone, and we have the card, and then we have the image below that, and you can see the image is going full bleed, which looks pretty good. So you can see without the lines. Okay, looks pretty good to me. All right, so let's write our tablet styles. So on tablet, in our grid template, instead of 12 columns for tablet, let's do 6 columns instead. And our gap is going up to 30 pixels. So in our tablet styles, let's change all the 12s to 6. So repeat 6 times and then divide by 6. And then instead of 11, we're going to go 1 less than 6, which is 5. And then everything else seems to be pretty good. So let's save that. Oh yeah, and then on our website, let's go to iPad view. And so right now we're kind of using the mobile styles for the card and the image. But I think for tablet, if we turn on the grid lines again, I think for tablet, we can fit them on the same row. So we'll just maybe do half and half, so 3 columns each, and then we'll make the image full bleed to the right again. And the other thing that I want to change for tablet is that on mobile we had the 100% minus 40 pixels to have 20 pixels of space on either side. But a lot of times in designs, the tablet is actually going to have a little bit more space if you're lucky enough to get a tablet design version, that is. So for tablet, I'm going to increase that space to be 40 pixels on either side instead of 20. So in our tablet styles for the grid, instead of minus 40 pixels, we have to say minus 80 to have 40 on each side. Okay, so now you can see we have a little more space on the sides of the tablet. So for our card, we want it to start at 2 again, And then we want to have it go halfway, which is 3. So 2 plus 3 is 5. So we'll make the grid column line end number at 5. There we go. And then for tablet image, we want to, let's just copy grid column. I should probably copy the whole thing because this is the desktop style. So for tablet, we are going to start at grid line 5 because that's where the card ended. And then we'll go to -1 again on the far right. Oops. There we go. So now we have, sorry, this horizontal scrolling is not for the iPad. So we should be good for that. So now we have the card on the left and the image is on the right, and the image is going full bleed. And we have the space on the left for the card. So I can see here's where we hit the mobile styles. And then here we go for desktop. Okay, and then let's also try and see if our desktop styles look good. Okay, so let's increase our viewport width, and I think we didn't do something right. Oh, for the image, for desktop, we need it to start at line 8, not 2. I think that was from our mobile styles. There we go. So now here's our desktop view of the website, and we have the image going all the way across to be full bleed. And then if we decrease, once we get below 1,000 pixels, we're now on the tablet styles. You can see there's 6 columns. And if we continue decreasing, then below 700 is our mobile styles. Cool, so I think this looks pretty good. So our styles are all working, which is great. However, the main downside is that the code in our styles just looks really complicated. And if I think about in the future, maybe months down the line, if I wanted to make some changes in these styles to change how the grid looks, by maybe changing the gap or the number of columns, then I would have to kind of parse this code and figure out what's going on before I can make changes. Or if another developer is working on this and they come in and look at this grid styles, it's not immediately obvious, what is happening and how to change things. So I think that it might be a good idea to modify this a little bit and make it more future-proof with the last and most complex level, which is making this a full bleed grid wrapper with CSS custom properties. All right, so one solution that I thought of would be to break some of these hard-coded values out to variables, meaning CSS custom properties. Because if you look at the styles, we basically did the exact same thing for all 3 versions. We just changed the value of some of the numbers in our style rules. So we could theoretically use just one grid template column style for all the different viewport widths, and then set up CSS custom properties and change those values on the different breakpoints. And if we give our CSS custom props descriptive names, I think that would help to more quickly understand, what's going on in the grid template column style, instead of having to look at all the math and parse it out yourself. So I am going to create our CSS custom properties just in this FB call wrapper class because it's the only place that we're really using them. So the first property is going to be the space that we want to leave on left and right for mobile and tablet. So I'm going to call this space-LR. And initially we're going to set this to 40 pixels. So that's going to be basically this number. So 100% minus space LR. Then let's add a media query for our custom properties. And I'm just going to copy what we have in tablet down here. And then also copy what we have for desktop, just for good measure. There we go. So I'm going to copy this space and then paste it down in our medium tablet styles. And we wanted to change it to 80 for tablet instead of 40. And then we're not changing it again for desktop, so we don't need to worry about that. So next up, let's create our gap space. So I'm going to call this space-gap. And we're going to start with maybe 20 pixels. and then it's going to go up to 30 for tablet. There we go. And then again, it's not going to change on desktop, so we don't need to add it there as well. So after that, let's do the number of columns. So let's do call count. And then on mobile, we had 2 columns, so we'll set it to 2. Then we'll copy that. On tablet, we had 6 columns. And then let's copy that again for desktop. And for desktop, we had 12 columns. Okay, so I think those are all the variables that we need. So next, we want to replace all the different numbers with their respective CSS custom properties. So let's do this space one first. And that is here, this 40 pixel number. So instead of 40 pixels, I'll say var, space LR. And then after that is the gap space. So I'll copy space gap. And the inner styles, that's going to be for mobile 1 times 20 pixels. So instead of 20 pixels, we'll say var space gap. And then we should probably also replace that in the gap property itself. There we go. Okay, and then we have call count. So again, we'll replace any of the instances where we had the number of columns. So instead of 2, it's going to be var call count. And then copy that whole var thing. And then we also want to divide by the number of columns. And then we also wanted to have a number of gap spaces, which was 1 less than a number of columns. And that was this number 1 that's like right here. So instead of number 1, we're going to say var call count minus 1. And then we also need to add another set of parentheses, which I know this is making this even more complicated, but around the -1 so that the subtraction happens before we multiply it by the space gap. Okay, so these are our styles, and if everything works, hypothetically, we should be able to then delete the grid template columns style rule in all of our media queries. So let's delete and let's save. All right, so the site looks pretty good. It looks the same as it did before we had the CSS custom properties, and we have the grid selected. And you can see down here, all of our styles, we have the CSS custom properties. And then what's kind of cool in Firefox is that in the actual style rules, if you hover over the custom property, it actually tells you the value. So right now on mobile, the call count is 2, which is right. Space LR is 40 pixels, which is also right. Space gap is 20 pixels. So that seems to be looking good. So let's try tablet. So once we hit that 700 pixel mark here, this is the tablet styles. And you can see we have the media query with the new values of these CSS custom properties there. And then if you look down here in the rules, again, you can see it tells you the call count, which is changed to 6 now, which is right. Space LR is 80 pixels and space gap is 30. So that looks good. And then once we hit 1,000 pixels, which is here, goes to desktop. And you can see we do have more columns there, and we have the image going full bleed. And again, we have, call count 12, space LR is 80 because it's not used on desktop, so that's fine. Space gap is 30. And yeah, so overall, I am pretty happy with this. It did take a lot of work to get this up and running, and it is kind of complicated. But again, once you have this set up, it does work, and you can just reuse, the FB call wrapper on basically any wrapper that you want to have this full bleed grid template. And if the design changes, you can more easily adjust the value of these CSS custom properties to match whatever that design says. So basically, you should be able to use these grid styles for any website that you need to build, unless it has a really unusual grid layout. Now, I do have all the source code in GitHub, which is linked down below in the description. So check it out and let me know in the comments what you think of this, if it's worthwhile or if you think it's just, too much work. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.